7 of modern church history. Continuing from last week, we are under point 3, early ecclesiological developments of newer churches. So churches do develop and evolve, on the right definition of evolve. Evolve depending on the context that the church is in. And we may call them newer churches and the rise of new churches, whatever you name them. There's a change. Could it be new? It could be back to old, that these changes. And one of the visible development in 20s and continuing to 21st century, and not so much of Western churches, but in third world churches, visible is a rise of Pentecostal churches and charismatic movement. So these churches, again, like I said last week, these are the churches that focus on the very active work of the Holy Spirit, which many times appears in a supernatural and paranormal or mystical way of the gospel. So this trend of Pentecostal churches does hit especially Latin America and Africa, because like I said, these characteristics of charismatic movement or the churches are more coincide with the characters and personalities of these cultures. And we all also discussed about ethnic churches, the development or rise of ethnic churches and national churches. And I explained the background of these churches are churches usually, not always, but usually in the nations and countries where the independence of the country from the colonial occupation or colonial authorities or power triggers rise of these ethnic churches and independent national churches. So it has to do with international political diplomatic development that impacted the religion and the churches. Emerging church. This is a new term that begin to come into scene or Christian scene beginning in the late 20th century. This is not just one particular church, but rise or the appearance of new paradigm in having to have a Christian congregation or community. And well, you could even include these Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches into that, but more than this denominational development, for example, there's what we call micro churches as one of the evident emerging churches, especially in Western world. The micro churches are the churches that probably less than 100 or even smaller, and also those house churches or home churches are also considered as emerging churches in Western world. House churches in, for example, in China or some of those restricted countries, I mean, restrict to the Christianity countries, it happens because of the need, the context. But these house churches in America or elsewhere in Western world is not necessarily developed from those restrictions, but from some other development and need that happens in this Western world. Mainly has to do with the decrease of the church in general. The Christianity is decreasing in number, and then is effect to the culture and the society. And because due to the decrease in numbers, I mean, it is natural for it to have smaller gatherings. And again, there is a trend that is, it's a notion that is against existing or traditional churches that is too institutionalized and too organized. And those who are having negative feelings or notions against, there's so much of systematic or systemization or organization, institutionalization, they tend to have or like to have freedom, more freedom or flexibility, and doesn't want the big mega churches. So because due to these trend or the notions, they begin to gather in a household, or small numbers. So those are some of the reasons that cause to have emerging churches. It's not so much of doctrinal or theological issues like they had before, but it's due more to the this new tendency and intention or the direction that they have toward a new trend in their personality, individuality, and so on. So we need to understand these emerging churches, and to understand emerging churches, you need to understand the new trend among this younger, especially the younger generation, who are having a different perspective and a different idea about their life, and especially their paradigm. So especially these what we call MZ generation, who were born after year 2000 and on, they are different than our prior generation. And then not only the context is different, they have different way of responding to the reality that they are in. And sign both in and out.
Today 19, right?
Yeah.
So
9.
we finish by June 9?
Yeah, that's the last clip.
Okay.
Okay, so continuing discussion on the title of Emerging Church. So the new emergence or the new development of new generation, it demands a new paradigm in doing this church and church services. The next topic, mega and micro church. I mean, like I said, micro churches, house churches, or the home church, and micro church that is probably 120 or 70, whichever number that you choose. The church that are less than and smaller than 120 or 70 are considered micro church. And then of course these house gatherings, house churches, which size would be less than 20 at the most, the members, and it's usually family oriented or friends who are very close. They can gather as a church on Sundays and do the worship, and then create a very unique spiritual community. And we call them micro churches. Mega churches, on the other hand, number like thousands and sometimes in hundreds. These are usually, if it's any church is bigger than 1,000 membership, we're considered as a mega church. And there's a trend. There used to be a trend of targeting and aiming at as a mega church, because it has to do with the development of what we call church growth movement that kind of started as a movement in Pasadena, because the Peter Wagner and I believe McGavran and these professors, they developed the idea that church needs to grow. And initially it was the idea was a church that growing as a result of being healthy. So mega church, church growth, it meant healthy church. And healthy church will result a growing church. And their principle at the beginning of church growth movement, the growth has to be organic, and it's a discipleship growth, and the personal growth and the spiritual maturity of individual believers will result in, at the end, the maturity and the growth of the whole church, the local churches. That was the idea of church growth. But later on, somehow it became more focused on the numeric growth of churches. So the number became very important measurement for evaluating the church growth rather than the spiritual maturity or spiritual growth. So that would result a movement toward a mega church. And mega church became a standard, and it became something that of ideal for the pastors to target and to promote. So that's somehow the church idea of mega church had happened. And in fact, one of the largest and biggest church in the world happens to be in Seoul, Korea. It's called Sunbogum Church, and they numbers 0.6 million. 600,000 members. I think it's more than that nowadays. But anyway, the number of one church, one local church, is 600,000 100,000, which is a lot. Yeah. So that's one of the what we call super mega church. Okay. Cell church. Cell church is another probably synonym for the micro church. So, but it's not just a number. When you want to have a cell church, it means as like the word itself connotates the cell is a cell of an organism, and the cell itself is an organism. So it's an organic church, church that is alive, not just a number. Cell church usually is a small church, usually 12 and under, because 12 is a number that Jesus had set when he was discipling his disciples. Not because Jesus was unable to disciple more disciples, but he is kind of giving us a guideline for the number of members in a church. I mean, in a discipleship community. Humanly, 12 would be the good or maximum number that one leader can handle. So that's probably the guideline for cell church in my definition and my understanding. So the church that is less than 12, not 13, 12. 12 would be the cell church in numeric wise or number wise. But the key to the definition of cell church would be its organic nature. Very interpersonal, very intimate, and it handles each individual member of church, and you can focus on each of them and have a very strict and systematic and well-organized discipling system because of the smaller number. So that's the cell church, which is one of the new development in late 20th and the 21st century. I already spoke of house church. House church is a church that will meet in an individual house, or in case of some countries, apartment, which will eventually limit the maximum number of the congregation that's gathering. But in case like in China, I heard that house church will hold almost 30 or plus people, the number of Christians in just one household, and they will have very silent worship there because they don't want to be discovered and so on. So that's a case of house churches, and these house churches are a development that had to happen, especially in China, because of the pressure and then restrictions that are still existing and there, and that they cannot meet in larger numbers, which will be easily discovered. With the house churches, it's difficult to find out, and so that would be the one reason. And okay, but again, like I said just few minutes ago, house churches in Western world, where there's a freedom of worship, it's due to the reason that mega churches or larger churches are becoming so impersonal and losing the main essence or ethos of the church that is personal and spiritual. For me, that's to be spiritual is to be personal, interpersonal, and relational in biblical way. So, larger churches, it's very difficult and hard to maintain, or even have some degree of interpersonal depth and relationship. So house church becomes an invention to go back to the key and essential element of a church, which is spiritual. So to be spiritual, in true sense of the word, or true definition of the word in a biblical way, it has to be small. Because there's limitation for one spiritual leader to be able to handle or disciple. It's not that many, and even as a pastor, you can preach to thousands or hundreds, without any issues. But the preaching is not everything. It's only one way of doing ministry. And many churches, many modern churches today heavily rely on the preaching that is done for 30 minutes to an hour on Sundays only, which will limit the growth and maturity of its believers, which is against. If it's not against, which is very limited to the biblical standard of discipling. So to overcome that, only way to do it is to have it small, or have the well-trained and prepared, mature leaders who's leading small groups. So that idea of having small groups that is led by the mature Christian leaders, that idea itself is great, and it's very ideal, but in reality it's still very difficult to have these well-trained, mature leaders who lead small groups, because they have to have the maturity and knowledge of just full-time pastor, and it's difficult to find anyone and leader at that level. It's not impossible, but it's not that possible to have that many leaders in a church, and especially when you're being like a mega church, it's not possible. So that's kind of a dilemma for a bigger churches, and that's why these house churches or cell churches become another trend, and so that explains decline of Western churches. It's obvious that the number of churches and then number of congregation in each individual local churches are decreasing in very rapid and obvious numbers. So the decline of the Western churches, including these churches in North America, is not anything new or anything that is mistaken, and it is obvious, and we are seeing it. And this, the speed or degree of decline is very rapid, and as the angle of the decrease is very steep, which worries many us Christian leaders. There are many reasons for that, but we will not go into that right now. But the rise of secularism, which begin to prevail from even 16th, 17th century in Europe and continue to grow until today. That's probably the main reason. So again, historically we go back to that Renaissance, Enlightenment, and then rise of the scientific worldview, causing like evolution and so on. These are some of the philosophical, cultural, social development that has caused church to decline, because people are no longer what we call spiritual, and they are being so materialistic and secular. Sometimes it's a synonym, but it's a two different worlds. Secularism, the main idea of secularism today is self-worship. That's how I diagnose this. So the self-worship, worship of yourself, and having to have a good self-esteem. That's one thing. And having to understand who you are, and having a healthy ego is another thing. But having to have self-centeredness, or you thinking you yourself as a center of the whole universe or the world, or your own thoughts to dominate yourself without having to cross-check your philosophy and your belief and your idea with the others or other beliefs, it becomes a very dangerous thing. And that's the center of modern secularism. So there's what we call postmodern, which the definition changes from the age to age. To postmodern, you say in the 20th century, is quite different from postmodern that we are saying today. But basically, the postmodernism is connected with the idea of what we call humanism. The humanism is the idea that you can do without God. So humanism is, in some senses, is a good thing, because you try to value the human or humanness as the major fundamental value for your worldview, which respecting and regarding the dignity and the value and the equality of human being. That's very good idea or good definition of humanism. But another definition of humanism is a human and human only. There's no God, or you do not need to be the slaves or the dependent of religion or God or gods. So that kind of humanism is the center of secularism, which will cause the church to decline. But for me, the major reason for decline of the churches or Western churches is not, you cannot blame the secular or secularism. I think it's primarily within. The church itself failed or keep failing to prove its own identity as the body of Christ. So church is being corrupted, being twisted, and it brings in the secular idea and belief into the church. I mean, the world is not forcing the church to take these ideas, but church unknowingly, unconsciously, sometimes knowingly and consciously, taking these secular values into the church and preach and think and believe that it is biblical. The major one of this is mammonism or materialism, and like I explained, the idea of church growth. Bigger the better, more the better. That's the idea of capitalism, and then also materialism or mammonism, which teach you to possess more is better. And not only is it better, it is ethical. That's kind of idea that comes into church, and the church grabs it and brings it and try to make it sound like it's a part of the gospel. So those, from my perspective, my understanding, church is bringing in, taking willingly, and sometimes with a desire and intention, brings in this secular idea and then takes it and makes it sounds like a part of gospel. So that is the main cause, for me, for the decline of the Western churches or today's churches. Not all of them, but majority of them. So the newer churches, it's not always good. It does have this bad and non-biblical or sometimes anti-biblical things that are happening in the newer churches of today in modern church. So as we are trying to understand this modern church history, that would be the major topic and theme that we need to be aware of and we need to respond correctly, appropriately, and aggressively to address these issues that are underlying and hidden on the decline of Western churches, or even including some Asian churches. Speaking of Asian churches, the rise of the third world churches, we have first world mainly. It's a Western world, including North America, Canada, USA, and all European countries. These are not all European, but a majority of European countries, what we call Western world, or free world, that's called first world. And then there's in-between countries. And the third world are usually underdeveloped, economically underdeveloped world that used to be under the colonial occupation of these Western countries and Western nations, and they are called third world. And now, usually these third world are in Africa and Latin America. and the development and the rise of the churches in these nations and these area, usually named as a third world, becomes a very visible phenomenon in the half of late 20th century and then 21st century that we are in. So there's a decline of Western churches while there's a rise of the third world churches. Some of the churches in these areas experience a growth rate that is 10% or more yearly, which is a remarkable and a very surprising speed of growth that you have not seen in since the beginning of early church. So you would ask, as a historian, anyone who's a Christian who would have some perspective, some historical perspective on church history, would ask why these things are happening. And you just look at the whole history of church history from the beginning to until 26th century. It goes around the globe, the earth, from Rome. I mean, it happens at the the Israel, the Judea, and then expand to Asia Minor, then eventually goes into Italy today, the Rome, and from there the Christianity flourished to all the Roman Empire throughout. So that's the first movement. Then after that, from Roman Empire to whole Europe, and then from Europe to North America, and from North America to Asia, and then at a similar time goes to Africa and Latin America. I mean, if you exclude the history of Catholic churches, just Protestant churches only, if you look at that, that's kind of trend beginning from Rome and going around the globe from east to west. That's the main direction of church history that kind of goes around the globe in that direction. So the rise of third world churches is not against that big trend, historical trend, and the direction we have witnessed it for the last 2,000 years. So it's a natural. I mean, it goes with the history that we have seen, and there's nothing new or nothing strange regarding these. So we do read that global flow of the church movement or the kingdom movement that happened. Okay. Let's take a 10-minute break. All right, let us continue our discussion and learning on the modern church history and the topic, newer churches. So, rise of the third world churches, and then anti-institutional church. Again, that connects with the already discussed cell church, house church, and so on. So this newer generation, they are more flexible. They do not want to be systemized or institutionalized, which leads to the new idea about doing a church. So it's natural for them to prepare themselves or make themselves available for this new idea of less organized churches. So we have already discussed that. And then new heresies and cults. This is a very alarming development in our Christian scene, and we have seen these new sort of or newer heresies, especially in the what we call the third world or second world churches. And if you look at, for example, I mean, I'm pretty familiar with what happens in the Korean churches and Korean American churches. And in last half century or so, since 1970s and on, as the church grows in Korea, at the same time, the heresies do grow with the churches. So it's like, I mean, it's something that you cannot avoid or hard to avoid, because it's not the work of God that these heresies rises. It's the work of the Satan. He tried to minimize the health and the growth of the church, or good church or proper church. One of the major strategy that Satan uses is to make these heretic churches and cults. So if the church grows, and then heresies also grows along with it. That's how the history does show. And these heresies sometimes overtake many believers or already believers. And that's what we see in Korea. I mean, there are some of the major heresies like Unification Church, and then JMS movement, and then Shincheonji. These things, they number hundreds, thousands of believers, more than. So these three major heresies alone would probably cover almost 1 million. So million, what they believe themselves to be Christian or biblical, solid biblical Christian, are not actually Christian. So million in Korea, in Korean church, is a large number. So that's how these heresies affect and degrade against the evangelical, good, Bible-believing churches. Okay, so that covers the church and churches. We'll go into the next topic, and topic 2 will be theological development. So when the church, as an institution, it's what we call hardware, and the change from hardware may bring change to its software, or change in software also brings change to hardware. It's a vice versa. It mutually works either ways. And the theology and the church, institutionalized church, are two major components that you would understand in terms of hardware to software. So if institutionalized churches or denominational churches are considered as hardwares, then theology and doctrine would be its softwares. So who manages and develop and work with these theology is theologians, or the sort of brain of the church. Okay, so we need to understand theology first before we go into how there's a theological development and changes were happening in the modern church history. So let's try to understand and look into theology. Theology as a fundamental academic discipline. When we speak of theology in such schools like ours, the theology is basically for us, professors and teachers and the students, it's as academic discipline. So you're studying theology, or theology is something that you need to study, like you study biology, chemistry, and physics, and so on. So it's a field of this academic subject, and then you are a student of a theology. And when you are in a school like this one, Christian school or theological school. So that's from usually the common definition in us in the schools, the seminaries and the Christian colleges. But the theology is not only an academic discipline, it's the fundamental theoretical foundation and basis for explaining in a systematic way of explaining Christianity or our belief in a very systematic and organized way. So that's what the theology is. So the need for explaining our belief in a very organized, logical, and systematic way, it brings the need for theology. And thus, the theology of the belief not only applies to Christianity, but other religions do have their own sort of theology. Even though they do not call it theology, they do have their own organized doctrines. Doctrine would be more neutral word, the word for theology, but doctrine in our understanding and in our academic understanding, it belongs to the theology. So it's as under category that's behind or lower category of theology. Now, the second term, theology proper. When we speak of, especially in systematic theology that you are also required to take as a student, the student of this, the college, the Christian college that you are in, is in the systematic theology that there's a term, theology proper, meaning this is under, again, it's a under category or under the field, subcategory of the systematic theology. So there's a systematic theology and then theology proper. So theology proper is a study of God or Godhead. So that comes under the theology or systematic theology that deals with the theology, soteriology, which means the theology of salvation, Christology, as the theology of Christ, Jesus as Messiah, and pneumatology is the study of Holy Spirit and so on. And ecclesiology is a study of church. So these are the topics that are under systematic theology, and theology proper will be study of Godhead, especially the God the Father, or biblical God. So that's the understanding of theology, because we are speaking of history of theology, modern theology, so we need to understand that. Theology as whole. That means the whole spectrum of these categories that are called systematic theology. Then theology as an interpretation. When we do theology, it does associate, or it contains, it has to contain, because of nature. It's a human thing. God does not give us theology. He is God, and we are speaking and talking about and trying to understand God and His will and the Bible and belief and so on. So God does not give us theology. Theology is a human development in effort to understand who God is, what His will is, what He says, the Bible, and so on. So because of the nature as a human thingy, and when anything is a human, and at least in Christianity, it does involve interpretation or your opinion. So theology basically is opinionated, meaning human perspective, human understanding, and human interpretation is or are involved. It is a must. So theology is not absolute truth, but it is relative, and it cannot be truth, even though it does deal with the truth. So we need to be really, really aware of the position of a theology in Christianity. It's relative, it's not absolute, it changes from time to time, depending on the trend, reality, and the people, and the denomination, and the culture, society, and even politics, church politics, and so on. And also, in the history, theology had influenced and changed, either positive or negative, according to or because of the context that it is in, or another way, the secular development also influences the development and the change of theology. So it is not unusual to see the secular event and the historical event that happens looking not in relation to Christianity will eventually have influence over the development and the idea of theology. So again, any theology that we see in today, whether it's evangelicalism or liberalism or liberation theology or any sort of theology that we see is influenced by human interpretation. And we need to take it account to that limitation of theology. Then also theology as an academic discipline I already spoke of. importance of theology, even though it does involve interpretation and it's not perfect as a human, basically it's a human, it's not an invention, but a human elements heavily involved in it. It does have importance for us believers. Number one, it does set or sets parameters and boundaries. So theology is there to draw boundaries of what is biblically sound and what is not biblically correct. So the main purpose of theology for us, any Christians, whether they are scholars or students or just plain congregation or leaders or pastors, whoever claims himself or herself as a Christian, you need to know theology, because it does set the boundaries between what is biblically good and what is biblically incorrect. And without having the basic theological knowledge and belief, the understanding, then you will not be able to distinguish or discern the truth, not truth itself, but the boundaries of truth. For example, if someone says Jesus is not really the Son of God, okay, or the resurrection is not the actual historical event that had happened, and the gospel, the writings in the gospel or narratives in the gospel regarding the resurrection event is not true to facts. It's modified, edited, and added and subtract. If someone says that, theology will say biblical infallibility and biblical authenticity and biblical authority. These are the concepts and words that sets the fine line, draws the boundaries of what to believe and what not to believe. So that's the very importance of what the theology does. And even though theology does change from time to time, the major the pillars or the core values, core truth of the theology does not change. And if that does changes, then we don't call that Christianity anymore. So that's again a boundary. So there's the purpose of theology is not only to help us to understand God and the message in the Bible, but it does draw a very fine boundary for us to not to cross. Second, again, that's another major function of theology, which is a very systematic explanation of our belief. Because our belief is usually is fragmented, it's not integrated. You do not learn Christian belief and faith by certain order unless you are put into very organized, systematic discipleship. And usually each church member the congregation will learn whatever comes first, not in a given certain order. So theology is needed to help the believers to have a certain organized system or make it integrated into a very structural system. So systematic meaning it's a way of giving what's more important, what's less important, which goes under which subject and title and concept and so on. So you're going to learn Trinity, for example, as a systematic way of explaining our Godhead, and without having that term Trinity, you need a long explanation to just use that concept. So Trinity you don't find in the Bible. There's no word Trinity appears in the Bible. But by saying Trinity, we do refer to a certain belief and idea and doctrine that is in the Bible. So that's an example of having a theology and as a systematic explanation. And another example, you would say incarnation, and that's a very the theological term, and it comes out of the Bible. But when you say incarnation in theology, it means the Jesus Christ, God Himself, coming into the world, having the flesh and bone of human existence. So that's sort of again a systematic explanation of what we believe. So it is necessary, the theology is necessary to have this very systematic explanation, and also because of that systematic explanation, we are able to communicate among the Christians without having to go through long explanation. So once it's termed and explained in theological terms, then you will be able to communicate without longer having to have an explanation for every concept. Okay. And so this it comes with a very practical need for us to communicate in a more organized and effective way among the believers, especially among the scholars. Third point, a rationale. Theology explains why of the many doctrinal or theological biblical topics. So when you ask why this and why that, for example, why Jesus need to be hung on the cross and die, since you could have, since He is God Himself, He could have came right off the cross, or not even go to the cross, and still saved all human generation. And then you ask why? What's the rationale for that? What's the reason for that? And the theology is there to explain those from the Bible. And of course, theology always uses the Bible as a reference, and then brings that truth from the Bible in a very organized and logical, systematic way, and then tell the listeners and the believers the reason and the motive for certain items and the subject and things that are in the Bible or out of the Bible. So that's third reason and the importance of theology. Number 4, reflects the context of change. Again, I told you that theology is the interpretation, and it is affected and influenced by the change that's happening within the context and outside the context. So as the history progresses and our perspective changes, and it doesn't reflect those changes that happen within the church or outside the church even. So that's another very function and the importance of theology that we are to study as a history. So basically the history of theology does focus on these changes and why these changes happen, what kind of change happen, and how these changes affected the church and the church growth, and eventually the kingdom of God. So that would be the question that we need to address as a historians of church, and especially regarding the theology or theological development. Continuing with the definition, theology, importance of theology, continuing with that, reveals emphasis and focus. Not all doctrines are the same, meaning they have different depth and different density and different weight. Some are more important than others. Some are more deep than others. So by doing the theology, that you kind of can label the importance of doctrines. And for example, the doctrine of resurrection and the virgin birth, these are more fundamental and deep truth than the theology of baptism. So there are scales or levels of the truth, even though each doctrine are very key and important. You cannot eliminate them, but there is still the different depth. And some need to be emphasized more than others. Some are more focused when you're studying. So again, for example, the doctrine of Trinity, doctrine of Christology, or the doctrine of Christ, or doctrine of resurrection, and then sin and death. These are some of the key important theological topics that need to be emphasized. Unless you study the theology, that you will not be able to distinguish these differences. So it is necessary, and if you to become a more mature Christian yourself, then even though you are not a student of the theological school or seminary, we don't require that kind of level, but still, each Christian should have least certain amount of theological understanding to his or her own belief. So that's a necessity, and that's a must, and you need to learn and study the theology to a certain degree to be able to distinguish more important doctrine than less important doctrine, and so on. Okay, then the perception of divinity. Again, the word divinity means God, or for us Christian, God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are the three the person of divinity or person of God. And you need to understand each divinity, because they're the same, but they are different. The difference and what's the same thing, you need to understand that, and that will make you a better believer. Okay, thank you for your presence, and I will see you guys next week. Okay, have a good day, and see you. This is our second hour in week number 6 on modern church history. And we are speaking of this shift. And there are these major shifts that happened, like we just looked at, reviewed a very short chronology of church history. And there are these moments where the history changes from A to A. Sometimes it's very drastic within days or weeks. Sometimes it takes months or years. But certainly there are these trends, what we call shift, and usually resulting a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is again, it's a way of thinking, how people perceive and how people interpret the reality. So we continue to do that as a human being, individually, sometimes as a whole ethnic group, and whatever the case is, that we continue to interpret and respond to the reality, and sometimes your perspective, your perception changes from A to B. Sometimes little, but many times very big shift, what we can call a shift. So that is a form of change, and the shift, since it's a drastic change, it does bring the drastic consequence and result from that change. Two, early ecclesiological development, new trend. So these are some of the new trends that we see in the 20th and then 21st century today. Denominationalism, which actually goes back to the 19th century. So it's not something that happened in 20th century, but in beginning with the 19th century, and within the Protestant, the Protestant itself, Protestants are the one who divide itself from the Catholic churches, but now within that Protestant churches, there are divisions usually due to theological and doctrinal differences. Usually it's not major. If it's a major difference, you might become a high heresy, but these are the minor things. For example, are you going to baptize baby or not? And most Presbyterian churches do allow infant baptism, but the Baptist churches, most conservative Baptist churches, they do not have this baby infant baptism, but instead we have what we call baby dedication. So that's totally two different things. Some churches allow congregation to have communion whether they are believers or not. And many churches, evangelical churches, do not permit or allow or ask the congregation, if you're not a born again true believer, just pass the elements. So that's sort of a difference. And another reason for having the denomination in the modern church history is because of the way they structure their church. So the power arrangement and also decision making in a church is different from A denomination to B denomination. For example, Methodist, they would have the top, who is called, what's the name? Overseer. And this overseer takes the care of several different regional leaders. And then these regional leaders will be responsible for the pastors in that area. So it's kind of structure the Methodists have. And the difference between a Methodist and Presbyterian, even though Presbyterian does have the similar structure, these the leaders of each region would not have the power to oversee or control the churches under. They do not have power to move one pastor to another church, but the Methodist does have power. The overseer, he has the power, or she has the power to move one pastor to another church and so on. So that's kind of difference. On the contrary, the Baptist, for example, especially the Southern Baptist, since I'm familiar with the Southern Baptist, each church is individually run. It has its own power to set the personnel and the money, finance, and politics. It's all individual churches. So each church has its own rights. And then they congregate as a convention rather than denomination. So convention is a gathering of each individual churches for the reason of reaffirming their confession and belief and doctrine. So these are some of the reasons that we have denominations or divisions. Sometimes these divisions are sour and with the fight. Sometimes it's peaceful and just signing the paper. You and I do not agree on certain things, so we're going to separate and build another group. That's very peaceful way. But many times they fight over these stuff and get divided. So whichever the case, this rise of denominationalism, it contributes, ironically, because of many denominations, the church has been expanded. That's kind of ironic, because they fight, they separate, and they build their own churches, and because of that, church expand. And this is not anything new, because we see the same thing happening in the Acts of Apostles. If we read the Acts of Apostles, we see the same thing happening there. So that's nothing new. Fight and divide and grow. That's one of the ways that the church expands. Hierarchic order to team order. This will be a very significant change in the modern church history. Many churches today, especially us Asian churches or Asian American churches, when we immigrate to America, it is different paradigm. In the countries that we were, Japan, China, Korea, it's a very hierarchy. You have head, and then sub-head, and then so on, and many ranks. And each exercise their own power and authority. When we come to America, we see much less hierarchy, 2 or 3 at the most, especially in church. And they do not exercise down to, like a downward hierarchy, but they do communicate up and down, and you can say whatever you want to the top leaders, and they will listen and so on. So that's quite different. So we see that and try to change and modify. One thing very, significant in, for example, Korean American churches. The first generation Korean American believers, including pastors, they are very used to that, hierarchic structure. Now, the second or 1.5 generation Korean Americans, they are very used to this horizontal structure and less hierarchy, because they were educated in American school system, and their thoughts and mind are very Americanized. We say ABC, right, in Chinese culture, American-born Chinese. So these ABCs are pretty different from those who are from China. And so that kind of cultural difference and gap we experience, and that sometimes create conflict. I'm sure the same thing happened in Chinese churches. But China has a longer history, immigrant history than Korean Americans. So I think you guys experienced in early in church history. But in Korean American churches, it happened like 20 years ago, very serious conflict. And those English-speaking Korean Americans separated themselves from the first generation church and established their own church. So I think it's happening to all the first and the second generation together churches. As we see that, because of the mindset and the thought and the culture can affect how church is organized, and even how church is functioning, and even how church is worshiping. So the English-speaking congregation, Korean Americans, worship very different style than the first generation. So as we see these things, this is not only happening in America, but it's a global trend. Because globally, we see the rise of democratic mindset. And it wasn't like that. You could have maintained that hierarchic culture and thoughts generation after generation. But until we have this internet and YouTube, that they can, as long as they have free access to the internet, not like in North Korea, then you see and you learn. And for the younger generation, it's a much better idea that everyone is the same and horizontal. You can say your opinion and freely and loudly, and you will not be punished for saying that. So it becomes like a global trend and culture, and it does come into the church as well. So now the church is more like a team-oriented, horizontal structure than it used to be. So what that means is the older generation may lose their voice. It is both good and bad, right? Always these things. It is good because you're not getting unnecessary comments or the interruption from the older generation. But at the same time, you are missing the wisdom and experience from the older generation. So it always works both ways. And the best for us today is to have unnecessary interruptions and interventions, take them away while translate and transfer all that good wisdom to the next generation. So that's what we need to do as in the in-between middle generation. So if we are successful, the church is going to grow healthy, but if we don't, then we see the very bitter separation, which happened a lot in Korean American churches that I know of. And I myself had experienced a lot of those, because I'm like a 1.5 in between, and then I many times don't understand why and how this first generation leaders do the ways they do it. And so I know this very well. Similar thing, authoritarian to autonomy. Autonomy is it's a very powerful thing, because you are generating this the initiation or the willingness from within yourself. But us who grew up in the Asian culture, you are told to do certain things, and that's how it should work. The authority tells you to do this, and you do that. And they tell you not to do this, and you don't do that. If you're going against it, then you're out of the culture. You're someone like ugly duckling. And that's how Americans say. So you're odd kind of person. You don't belong to the society and culture. But that does not produce willingness from within the culture itself. And if the church is the same, then we have problem. But the church is the same, used to be. Now, this new generation in 21st century, they want to be everything to be autonomic, meaning if I don't like it, I don't do it. If I don't want it, I don't do it, and it's okay. It wasn't used to be okay. It would be the big problem. But for this MZ generation or new generation, they, whatever, I mean, you tell me, I don't listen, and that is okay. And so that's kind of mentality. But I see this autonomy is the most powerful thing for any Christian works, Christian endeavor, discipleship, and the church attending, everything. So I'm on that side, autonomy side, than authoritarian. But many first generation leaders, pastors, they are still authoritarian. I mean, especially speaking of Asian American churches. Next, congregationalism. I'm not so familiar with that, so I'll just skip that one. Newer trend, continuing, Presbyterianism. So that's, again, a denominational thing. Okay, going back to congregationalism. That's basically the Baptists are the idea of Baptist organization of individual churches. Each congregation, each local churches has its own power to decide its own fate. So that's what the major idea of congregationalism. So each congregation is separate. They have their own power to decide what to do with their own churches. Presbyterianism is the idea of representative politics, meaning you choose a certain representative and you do the election for your own representative, and they come up to the higher level and gather together and make a decision. That's what the Chinese Communist Party are doing. I mean, when President Xi, when he gathers a representative from all over the China, they gather together and do this massive, how to say, we call it 대회. It's a great gathering, and then make all these important decisions every year, then every 5 years. So that's sort of a similar picture. So it is important to choose right presbytery, meaning usually in a Presbyterian church, presbyters are the elders. Elders, they are the again presbyteries, and they gather sometimes monthly and then make decisions for the church. So who choose these elders? Of course, the congregation do make an election and choose the presbytery, and they form a presbytery, and then they make a decision. So it's again representative politics. So you choose your representative, and they make the decision. Same thing in the USA president election is also that style. They choose the delegate, and these delegates go and make a final decision and who to choose. Usually, delegates are the members of the party. So if you have more Republican Party, then Republicans usually win. The Republican president candidate will win, and then other way, vice versa. Then regional dominion. I'll skip that. Bishops and synod. That's again, that's a Methodist. They have a bishop and synod, and it's an area by area regional politics. And then what's different is each individual local churches belong to certain synod, and the bishops are the top leader who's making decisions, especially the personal decisions. I mean, personal resources. They relocate them, and that's how the system works. Brethren tradition. I'm not so familiar with the brethren tradition, and one thing that I know, and I had experienced the brethren tradition myself, because while I was in Africa, that the church that I attended a couple of times were brethren, and then what they do, they come on Sunday, and there's no pastor actually. So one of them, led by Holy Spirit, comes to the pulpit in front and begin to preach. So each Sunday, you do not know who's going to preach and on what passage and so on. And so that's one thing that I saw, so that I can speak of. So the leadership style is pretty different. And actually, that is a leadership style that we see in the New Testament, the Acts. And they say that's how the early church has done it. So we do still keep that. And so that's brethren tradition. So these are some of the development that mainly happen in America. So when we are talking of modern church history, if you're not speaking European churches, because European churches, it died very gradually during this modern church history, and the rise of American churches. So when we speak of modern church history, it's mainly North American churches that we are talking of. And all these things did happen mainly in America, not all, but mainly majority of the things that we are seeing, the new trend that happened in American church. Third, early ecclesiological development, new churches. Pentecostal churches and charismatic churches. Like I said, especially in Latin America, these Pentecostal and charismatic movement of the churches become the major trend. While the Baptist and Presbyterian and Methodist were the major church trend in North America. If you compare two this trend, one is the word or Bible centered, meaning they do focus on the reading and studying of the Word of God and preaching it from the Bible. On the other hand, this charismatic and Pentecostal movement are more focused more on prayers and then very dynamic worship. So that kind of, it separates two trends. But on the bottom of this is is a word or prayer. So which is better? Can tell. Both are good. I mean, you want to balance the word, study of word, and then the prayer or the thinking and the feeling, balanced. But in reality, individually and as a group, you kind of fall into, inclined to this or that. So as something that you cannot avoid, there's no perfect balance. So you kind of go either way, because that's how God had built us individuals. You're either thinking person or a feeling person. You cannot be both balanced thinking and feeling. It's rare. It's not impossible, but it's rare. Next, ethnic churches and national churches. Like I said before, the development that happened, the trend of having the independence, political independence from the colonial European powers, majority of those African countries and Latin American countries, they now begin to see themselves as an independent ethnic or national identity or entity. So having that entity, it relates to their identity, and they realize who they are, and that begins, or that gives the new identity to their churches. So usually these churches in Latin America and Africa were helped and financed and ran by these colonial leaders, even in the church. So white pastors preach in black African church. They're usually the case. And even if the African black pastors are preaching in African churches, they were not financially independent or politically independent, meaning for example, churches in English colonies are strongly associated with Anglican Church. And those Dutch churches, same thing. So these, visibly and invisibly, these churches that were in the colonial nations, they are under, it is literally under the authority of this colonial church. And as politically they are liberated, church begin to see. But it took a longer time than the political, because it's a church. Because it's a church, you don't kick out the white pastor because he's white. It doesn't happen that way, especially like South African churches in South Africa. Majority of the churches pastors were white. So it went on, but eventually they tried to have, and there is a very strong trend and effort to have their own church without the intervention or the support of outside churches or national church. So that's kind of trend we saw in this modern church history, and we'll continue to discuss that. And I'll see you guys next week. Okay, thank you. Have a good week, and see you.
You too. I've been to 3 churches in America, one in Florida and 2 in California. But I think the Chinese church are all first generation church. I have never been to a second generation church. I think the second generation, they go to the Western church.
They do?
I don't know of any like all the American-born Chinese church. But I don't know, but I just assume.
Wow.
But the Koreans, they have the second generation church.
We have many.
Oh, okay. Most of the churches here are set up by the Taiwanese. By Taiwanese.
Taiwanese churches.
But there's 3 old Taiwanese church I've been to. Mandarin church.
Okay. So
But because I've seen some, I joined some, participated in some programs, activities from the Western church for the Chinese students, UCR. And they have some helpers from their church, and those Chinese are the second generation church. So I don't know, but I think it's a little bit different.
yeah, it's different.
I think Chinese people are more want to join the Western.
Adaptive.
Yeah. Bye bye, teacher.
Yep.
Bye bye. Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week.